So welcome everybody to another week of Talk, Taste, and Travel. This is our weekly Wind Down Wednesday event, and we are wrapping up our journey to the ancient world this week and visiting Israel and Lebanon. I want to thank our producers of this week, of this 3-week segment, Kate Wilson, Gretchen and Ken Reddy, Louis Riccadello, Mary and Doug Sandvig, Margot Getty, and Bill and Lynn Schreiber. This would not be possible without you guys, so we're super grateful for your assistance. And Adele, would you like to hop on and introduce yourself to everyone? I know we have a few people joining us for the first time, so say hello and tell us what's happening at 13 this week.
Hi, I'm Adele. I am the general manager and wine lady over at 13 Celsius Wine Bar in Houston. And we reopened, so we got our permitting and everything like that to open up like a restaurant. So we are in our, day 10 of service, and it's been busy. So if you guys have been missing us, come on by and have a glass of wine. And for those who supported us during the time that we were to go only, thank you so much for coming by and grabbing some retail bottles and stuff. We are happy to be back open for sure, and life is less boring. That's definitely true. And going forward, for those of you guys who are looking to pick up the wines for the Talk, Taste, and Travel next series that we're gonna announce later today, we are full service now, so calling ahead, if you call the day of, we are not able to answer the phone, so you're just going to have to come into the bar, and the staff has been prompted to grab the wines for you, and have been told how to do it. So unless if you send me an email like the day before, then I can get everything together, but if you're coming by the day of, just park and come on into the bar.
Thanks, Adele. And I do just kind of want to touch on something really quick before we move on. I'm sure many of you guys have heard about the wildfires that are happening in Northern California right now, and specifically the Napa Valley. Many vineyards that grew the wines I learned to drink wine from have burned down, and some of my hotel partners in the Valley have also burned. So for our next segment, we're going to be opening up, rather, if you produce one of the segments, we're going to be donating it towards wildfire relief. And I'm going to be matching the donations that we receive for it as well. So if you produce an episode, you'll be donating to a really good cause. So with that, let's get to the Middle East. Let's get into the fun stuff today. So we are off to our first stop and headed to Israel. Our journey through the ancient world continues, and we'll touch down into Tel Aviv and head straight to Jerusalem to begin our trip. With Israel being roughly the size of New Jersey, travelers who are short on time can easily base from either Tel Aviv or Jerusalem to see the highlights of the country. However, those looking for a more immersive experience can choose to stay in Galilee, the Negev Desert, or even cross the border into Jordan and visit the Red Sea. From Israel, we'll continue north into Lebanon, and while these destinations are virtually combinable and we can just head right over there, a single trip typically won't allow you to visit both just because of the political differences. Fortunately, Israel no longer stamps your passport, and that's so you can visit other countries partially so you can visit other countries in the Middle East, just because the politics there can get a little dicey at sometimes. However, Beirut, like Tel Aviv, is a great place to base when you are exploring Lebanon. And surprisingly, the destination combines easily with Paris, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And it is a simple way to plan the culinary vacation of a lifetime. So next, we will head straight into Israel and visit and begin our trip in Jerusalem. So a pilgrimage to Israel opens travelers to this complex modern world that's juxtaposed against the country's ancient wonders. Worshippers from many faiths come to visit the religious sites, and intrepid adventurers with contemporary attitudes swarm cosmopolitan cities, bustling with bars, boutiques, and nightlife. Your journey begins when you touch down in the international city of Tel Aviv, and it is Israel's financial and cultural epicenter. If you travel about an hour out of Tel Aviv, you'll arrive in Jerusalem. And many travelers prefer to explore the Holy Land through the lens of their faith. So regardless of what that is, it is a pilgrim city of choice to begin their journey back in time. Those who do have a little bit more time can immerse themselves in more of the natural landscapes of the country. Whether you're visiting the glistening northern coastlines or the shores of the Dead Sea, simple mountain village communities or lively cities full of bars and boutiques, a vacation here will surprise you at every turn. Tel Aviv is the modern metropolis and technology capital, and it's a place more geared towards the future than to the past. So you'll end your trip here today with a few nights there as you reacclimate to the 21st century before you begin your journey home. So now I would like to get into our first wine of the day, and I believe we have Chris Poldoian joining us again from By the Glass, and he's going to tell us a little bit about Middle Eastern wine.
So Chris hasn't arrived yet. He's stuck in traffic. So as soon as he gets here, we'll loop him in and stuff like that.
For sure.
But we can definitely jump into the Israel and what to know about the region.
Perfect. Well, Adele, in that case, I'll pass it off to you. Tell us what we should know about Israeli wine and kosher winemaking techniques.
So if you're going to visit Israel, there's a couple different wine regions that exist throughout the place. Most people think of Israel and probably think that it's just this like super dry, vast desert. But indeed, there's a lot of different sites that are really good for viticulture. And the country actually boasts remarkable diversity in different climates and also just different elevations and areas that can plant and cultivate vines. If you start at the very history of winemaking in Israel, the recorded history is documented in ancient texts like the Bible. Has anyone ever heard of the Bible?
I remember studying it in school a little bit.
It's very old, but anyway, the book of Genesis referenced Noah's plantings of vineyards. After the recession of the Great Flood, Moses, en route from Egypt, receives a cluster of grapes from the land of milk and honey, which was a reference to the bounty of the Promised Land. And then, of course, archaeological findings verify these reports, and that evidence of ancient winemaking in Israel is there, which is pretty cool. So super duper old areas that vines have been growing and accessing that same sense of terroir for thousands and thousands of years. But it really wasn't until the 1880s that foreign investment came into Israel to start making really good quality wine. And that started with this guy. His name is Baron Edmund Rothschild, or Rothschild Rothschild. He has a property called, Chris just arrived, but he has a property called Chateau Lafite, which is one of the first growth Bordeaux in France. Super famous, iconic Bordeaux chateau. And he was considering bringing some sort of investment into Israel and helping them make modern wines. And it was through inspiration of like a wealthy member of the Jewish European family that they were pals with, and they basically went down and taught them how to make wine, how to use barrels correctly, but also, and most importantly, planting French varietals and actual cuttings of Lafite, Chateau Lafite in Israel. And you can actually, I think they still exist to this day, which is pretty cool. But they planted these near Mount Carmel, which you can go over there and visit and see. But otherwise, we have a couple different regions, some of which are better than others. So in the north, you've got the mountainous region of Golan Heights, and that's like the very, very tip, like almost border of Lebanon. And this is actually volcanic soils, and it's about 1,200 meters above sea level. So you wouldn't really expect that from that region, but you're pretty high up. From the west, from there, you're going to find the region of Galilee, which is close to that super shallow lake that's almost 200 meters below sea level. So you've gone from like a pretty drastic, like high elevation to like very, very low elevation in a very short distance. Other wine regions that are definitely well known are the Judean Hills, and the soil there is really interesting because it's comprised of terra rosa topsoil, which you find throughout the Mediterranean, but we also talked about when we were in Australia. So it's kind of a unique soil type that's found there too.
Super interesting.
Yeah, so the grapes that you mostly find by the influence of the French, Cab, Merlot, Syrah, and then your whites, Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, and sometimes a little bit of Viognier. There's only a handful of indigenous varietals, but you don't see them very often. They just aren't as great.
That's really interesting. Because I was kind of surprised, you know, we always talk about, I guess, how approachable the names of the grapes are and the names of the wines are when it comes to shopping around and seeing a Chardonnay and seeing a Cinsault or a Cab blend. These are all really familiar to us. So I thought that was something that was kind of cool. Tell us a little bit about kosher winemaking techniques and what makes that different from just regular winemaking techniques.
Kosher winemaking is fundamental to the Israeli wine industry. But it's also extremely misunderstood. Kosher wines can be made in any wine growing region around the world. It doesn't just have to come from Israel. There's estates and properties around, you know, in France, and also there's one that I work with at the bar from Argentina, and they are all kosher as well. Even sherry, there's a Tio Pepe does a kosher bottling of their wines. And while most Israeli wineries, especially the large ones, definitely produce kosher wines, but some of the smaller wineries don't follow the kosher practices. So it's kind of interesting to see a little bit of the differences between them, but there's really no taste difference. The only taste difference that you'll ever find in a wine that's kosher is if they're mashubal, and that means that they've been like flash pasteurized. So they've been like heated and then brought down to temperature. And I don't know if you guys ever had cooked wine before, but it's not great. It's sweet and tastes off, and it's not so good.
Definitely not. But it is, I assume the wine that our first wine of tonight is kosher. Is that correct?
It is, yeah. So it is kosher, and basically it just means that they have to adhere to like some winemaking things. They have to have the grapes and the barrels only handled by Sabbath observing Jews. But many of Israel's winemakers, however, are more secular. Therefore, there's that difference between the large houses and some of the smaller producers that don't always do kosher wines. And or if they do want to make a kosher bottling, they just can't engage in the physical activity. Like they physically can't touch the grapes or the bottles. They have to have someone come in. They can tell them what to do, but they physically just can't touch it anymore.
Interesting. So with that, let's get into our wines today. We have 3 different wines as usual that we're drinking, with 1 from Israel and 2 from Lebanon. And I've already opened the first wine, the Yarden, which is our kosher wine for those of you who are drinking it with us. And to me, it really does taste like a typical Chardonnay. I think if you enjoy New World Chardonnays, if you enjoy Old World Chardonnays, this fits right in there really easily, where you have some of those really, iconic characteristics of it. You have some of that creaminess, a little bit of that butteriness, some of that oak. Tell me a little bit more about this wine and about Yarden.
So I wanted to choose something that was a little bit familiar for most people. This to me is very much so, like if you were to put this side by side with like a Napa Chardonnay, like a California Chardonnay, like with the oak quality on this, I think you would satisfy anyone's aunt, grandma, mother-in-law who like your oaky, buttery Chardonnays. But it's a really interesting wine, and it comes from Galilee, which is more in the north, close to that super shallow lake, which is one of Israel's largest wine growing regions. They have a diverse variety of different soils, but this was started as a project in 1976 and it's actually a part of another winery called Golan Heights Winery, which is pretty famous because they were established fairly early on in Israel's resurgence of quality winemaking. And they have different blocks that are all individually harvested and fermented separately. They have a lot of care that goes into the wines, and their head winemaker has been with them for a very long time. They each have like a very distinct sense of like Israeli terroir that I think is really cool because they combine some like state-of-the-art wine growing technologies, but then they also blend in traditional winemaking techniques. So it's kind of like an old versus new kind of coming in, one of which is that the fruit that they source is high elevation, and they spend about 7 months in new French oak barrels. So kind of like combining like a little bit of old and new. What do you guys think?
I think it's really good. I think it's an easy drinking Chardonnay, and it has, it definitely has those components of the New World Chardonnays, but it isn't too like vanilla, and it isn't too overpowering for my personal taste.
Yeah.
If anyone else wants to jump in on the chat and share your thoughts, we would love to hear about it. And let's talk about food pairing with this wine as well. We sent out a couple of recommendations, but Chris, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this. Last week we said, if it grows together, it goes together. And I sent you guys a suggestion that Adele and I talked about. It was crab cakes with remoulade, which we thought would go really well with this. But let's talk a little bit more about typical Israeli dishes. And Chris, do you have any thoughts on pairing it, and what cuisines you think would go really well with it?
Yeah, totally. I mean, for me, I love couscous. Anything made with like really fresh herbs. You know, sometimes in the wine world, we talk about like hard herbs or dried herbs, or we talk about soft, you know, fresh herbs. And for me, this wine works so well with like basil, with thyme, with oregano. There's just such like a fresh, bright character to it. You know, there's that natural acidity and that kind of salty finish. You know, I want things that have that kind of Mediterranean influence to them. You know, fresh tomatoes, maybe something with like a little bit of falafel as well. I mean, falafel to me is like, yeah, game over. That's what you want.
It's kind of a hearty white wine too, so it can really hold up to some of those like heavier meat dishes and some of the spices in there as well. If you guys would like to share any of your recipes or what you decided to pair with it tonight, put them in the chat box. We want to hear. And with that, let's keep things moving and dive a little bit into the destination. I would like to welcome our second guest tonight, who I am super excited to have with us. Maria Merrill is a Houston native, and she and I actually went to middle school and high school together at Duchesne. And Maria works for Artisans of Leisure as a senior travel specialist and tour designer. And Artisans of Leisure was named the #1 tour operator in the world in 2018. And then for 2020, they were named the #5 tour operator in the world. And so with that, Maria, I'd like to invite you to unmute yourself and to say hello to everybody.
Hi, everyone. Can y'all hear me?
We can.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm super excited to be here. You know, thank you for having me. It's always really fun for me to be able to talk about my favorite destinations, and two of my favorite destinations in the world are Israel and Lebanon. So I'm just really excited to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. I remember in high school that you went on the, what was it? One of the summer trips to
Greece and Italy.
Yeah, to Greece and Italy. And I remember you being super excited about Greece because you loved the ancient history, like I did, of Greece and Egypt and kind of all of these ancient civilizations surrounding the Mediterranean. And so it does not surprise me at all to find us here tonight talking about some of these places. So before we get into Jerusalem, I think one of the questions that I get all of the time when planning travel to the Middle East, and I'm sure it's the same for you,
Yeah.
is it safe? And so how do you advise travelers what is kind of typical noise that's happening and going on in the country, and when to like actually put your flags up and to reconsider visiting the destination?
Yeah. So yeah, definitely one of the most common questions I get as well. You know, I have been numerous times to the Middle East. A couple of those times as a solo female traveler. I have never personally felt unsafe. And the feedback that I get from my clients when they return is that they were surprised at how safe and comfortable they felt. I think, you know, the media tends to cover, you know, obviously what sells. And, you know, it doesn't cover the part that real life goes on and people are living their normal lives and it's safe, you know, outside of certain isolated incidents. But just in general, I mean, there's a high security presence in Israel. You know, the government takes the safety of tourists, especially US travelers, very seriously. And I would say this is the case for other countries in the region as well, you know, including Egypt, Lebanon, Oman, Jordan. One of my, you know, recommendations, and granted, you know, Artisans of Leisure does comprehensive tours with guides, but I do think, you know, one of the best ways to ease any concerns that, you know, travelers might have initially over safety is by having a guide and driver or a driver guide with you. It's just really great to have someone local who's in the know to help you not only navigate the area safely, but also navigate, especially in these regions, the layers upon layers of history. So that's, I mean, kind of my, you know, sort of top recommendation is just having someone there. And like I said, everybody comes back saying that they were just so surprised at how safe and comfortable they felt. One other thing that I want to note that is just so incredibly exciting and historic are these peace agreements that Israel is forging with Bahrain and the UAE, which will likely lead to additional peace agreements in the region. I think that this will not only transform the region, but it will really alleviate a lot of those concerns that travelers have over safety in Israel and the Middle East. So I think it's really exciting, and I think we have a lot to look forward to in that regard.
That's super exciting, and that makes me really happy to hear. I was supposed to actually go to the Middle East for my honeymoon, but my husband hurt his knee, so we had to postpone for 2020 and then postpone again for 2021. So it's a part of the world that I've always been really excited to get to, and to know that when that happens, it might be easier to kind of seamlessly connect destinations in that area is super exciting. So with that, let's check into our hotel in Jerusalem before we get into some sightseeing. We chatted a little bit about some of the best places to stay. And so tell us what separates these hotels from one another and which of the properties you would put like each traveler at, depending on their tastes and interests.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, Jerusalem has a ton of options, but you know, these three with a couple of others are really, you know, the top options, I would say. I mean, the King David is arguably Israel's most iconic hotel. It's a historic hotel that's hosted a lot of celebrities and state officials. It's a great central location, walking distance from the Old City, along with great views of the Old City. Their deluxe Old City rooms on the top floors are, I think, some of the best rooms. Yeah, I think it provides like a real sense of place. If you're looking for an iconic historic hotel, this is where to stay. You know, right down the road, you'll find the David Citadel, the MAMILLA Hotel, and the Waldorf Astoria. Those are more contemporary options, but they definitely, all three of them incorporate traditional elements into their design. The David Citadel is a great option because it offers, a lot of their rooms offer just totally awesome views of the Old City. The MAMILLA Hotel is a smaller, more boutique, kind of sleek, modern hotel. So I find that that one's not for everyone, but if you like small, intimate boutique hotels, that's a really good option. Waldorf Astoria is a larger sort of classic luxury hotel with both modern and traditional interiors. The rooms don't have views of the old city, but that's a great option, and people are always really happy when they stay there. And then one other hotel that I just want to mention is the American Colony Hotel. That one's really unique, and I actually prefer the interiors. It's an old Ottoman palace. So it's
Very
got
cool.
really unique design and interiors, and it has a great atmosphere. The problem is the location is not as ideal, so I actually don't usually end up recommending that one, just because it's not a location where you can just walk out and be, you know, in the middle of everything.
Right, for sure. So I do have a quick question from Julie Pitts, who's with us today, and she said, other than being small and boutique, what's the unique selling point of the MAMILLA? What do people love about it?
I mean, it's definitely the newest hotel. You know, it opened with quite a bit of coverage. Really, honestly, it's not my personal favorite. I do think that its biggest selling point, I mean, its location is the same as all of the others. So it's a great location right next to the old city. But it just doesn't have the same old city views that a lot of the other hotels have. So I think its selling point is that if you are interested in a more modern, more boutique hotel, that's the option for you. But again, you know, I personally would recommend other hotels over it, but it, you know, is the preference for others to be in that.
Good to know. Well, let's get into the fun stuff and do some sightseeing. So you shared, so Artisans of Leisure has some of the best itineraries for traveling in the Middle East, in my opinion, when I look at the virtuoso tour operators there. And you shared some really cool insight into different things to do. So tell us a little bit about your trip through Jerusalem and then into the rest of Israel and how you would do it.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, Jerusalem is, you know, a great starting point. I mean, you know, when most travelers think of Israel, they're thinking of just the really significant sites that you find in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem itself is just such a fascinating city. You know, it's of an enormous significance to Jews, Christians, and Muslims. So it just offers this really fascinating mix of cultures, which I think can be found best in the walled Old City, which is also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. You've got the four quarters of the walled Old City, the Jewish quarter, Muslim quarter, Armenian quarter, and Christian quarter. And you can really tell the difference when you walk between the different quarters. And it's really interesting to see how these different groups really coexist in, you know, this fairly small space. But yeah, I mean, in terms of, you know, highlights of Jerusalem, you know, within the Old City, you have obvious sites that are of significance to Christian travelers, like the Via Dolorosa and the Stations of the Cross, which, you know, essentially marked these significant moments along the route that Jesus took during, you know, on the way to his crucifixion. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was built on the place of his crucifixion, burial, and resurrection. And then obviously, you know, the Western Wall is huge. It's, you know, Judaism, one of Judaism's holiest sites. You know, it's really incredible to watch people worship at the wall. And if you feel moved to do so, you are able to go up, you know, write a prayer on a sheet, stick it in the wall, or just touch the wall and, you know, pray or whatever it is that you feel like doing. But one of the things that I really highly recommend that not everyone knows about is taking a tour of the Western Wall tunnels. There's basically an underground portion that's under the Muslim quarter that basically provides, on this tour, you're given access to parts of the Western Wall that are essentially buried, they're underground. And through this, you learn the history, as well as, you know, learning about archaeological finds, such as, you know, these Roman era streets and this Roman era water channel and sewage system. So it's just this, you know, 45-minute, really interesting tour that I highly recommend, you know, when you visit the Western Wall. You know, outside of the Old City, Obviously, you know, there's Mount Zion and Mount of Olives, which are significant sites as well, religiously and historically. But there's also the Israel Museum, which is known for exhibiting the Dead Sea Scrolls, and Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum. You know, Machne Yehuda Market in Israel is, I think, just an absolute highlight, especially if you're a foodie. You know, it's this huge market with more than 250 vendors. And the best way to experience it is by having a tour with an expert culinary guide who can help you navigate the market, you know, introduce you to the best stalls within the market. You get to have these great tastings of local specialties along the way. You can try fresh challah and Jerusalem bagels, local fresh fruit and vegetables. It's just a really excellent culinary experience that I highly recommend. Outside of Jerusalem, you know, Bethlehem and Jericho are, you know, obviously must-sees for some travelers. But the excursion that I think is a must for, you know, all first-time travelers is Masada and the Dead Sea. So for those of you that don't know, Masada is a 2,000-year-old mountaintop fortress and UNESCO World Heritage Site. It has incredible views of the Judean desert and the nearby Dead Sea. It was built by Herod the Great, but it is so well known and became significant in Jewish history because Jewish rebels seized the fortress and made their last stand against Romans during the first Jewish Roman War. And I think most of y'all are Texans, so I thought y'all might appreciate this story. Apparently, when Rick Perry visited Masada, he heard the story of the Jewish rebels and teared up and basically said it was just like the Alamo. So I thought that was kind of a funny story. Yeah, Masada, you know, obviously pairs really well with afterwards. You can go float in the Dead Sea because it's right there. Usually what we recommend is, you know, scheduling yourself with a nearby hotel so you can use their spa and shower facility afterwards because it's very salty. But yeah, from Jerusalem, I would say those are kind of the main sort of must-see highlights.
Awesome. And so as we travel north to Galilee, tell us a little bit about what you recommend doing here. I know this is the Sea of Galilee also has some really special religious sites, but this is also where our wine is from. And I know Golan Heights is kind of right next to that general area. And you told me about some really cool culinary experiences that are there as well. So let's go into a little bit more detail with that.
Sure. Yeah, obviously there's a lot to see and do. The area is packed with historical and biblical sites. But a couple of notable experiences that I really like recommending for, you know, travelers who are interested. In the Golan Heights, you know, we typically arrange the opportunity for you to dine in the home of a local Druze family. So you get a home cooked meal. It's a really great sort of culturally immersive experience where you have the opportunity to interact with the family members and learn about the Druze religion, which is sort of like an obscure branch of Islam, although I don't think they would describe themselves as part of the Islamic faith, but that is where they like originally branched off from. But it's a very spiritual religion. So it's a really unique, excellent experience. You get a great home cooked meal and you get to chat with locals, which is always fun.
For sure.
I mean, obviously lots of wine touring in the area. You can visit local family run boutique wineries and tastings. And then there's tons of great hiking. There are, you know, a number of nature reserves. One in particular is the Banias Nature Reserve. It's really stunning. You can do a 90-minute hike to a beautiful waterfall.
Oh, wow.
And on the reserve, you can also see ruins of a city that was associated with the Greek god of the wild, Pan. So that's something a little different. That's not like the typical sort of ruins you might see. So that's really
so fun.
Yeah.
What a like interesting way to kind of switch things up and to and kind of break up the trip as well, because I imagine if you want to visit lots of these sites, which you probably do on a bucket list trip, you don't want to get fatigued from doing too many of them. And so having experience like this interwoven throughout the itinerary makes it a really good way to keep everything fresh and to stay excited about what's next. Tell us where you would stay in the area.
Yeah, so there are, a few options to choose from, but the only one I'll really tell you about today is my personal favorite, the Scots Hotel. It's essentially a converted 19th century stone hospital, but it's this beautiful setting, as you can see in some of these pictures. It's surrounded by beautiful gardens. You've got, these panoramic views of the Sea of Galilee. So it's just this really atmospheric setting. The food is excellent. You're ideally located right on the Sea of Galilee, near, close enough to all of these sites. And it's actually one of, a handful of non-kosher hotels in Israel. Most hotels are kosher.
Very cool. And how many nights would you stay in Galilee as part of a bigger Israel trip?
Yeah, I would say the average is 2. But if you really, there's so much to see. You could spend 3-4 nights there and still not have seen everything. But I would say on average, 2 nights is a good amount to get like an introduction to the region.
Very cool. Well, let's continue on and journey south to the Negev Desert. Am I saying that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So when I think of visiting the Middle East and visiting North Africa, especially if it's my first trip, you think about these beautiful desertscapes. So what makes the Negev different from like the Sahara or the Wahiba Sands and the other deserts in the Middle East?
Sure. There are obviously a lot of similarities, but I'd say that the main difference, in my opinion, is Maktesh Ramon, the Ramon crater, which is this gigantic erosion crater that's 25 miles long and over 1,600 feet deep. It's so impressive. And I know we're going to get into it, but I'm going to touch on it a little early. The Bereshit Hotel in the region is positioned just right on the edge of that crater. So you have the most incredible location and views from the hotel. You can kind of see it, the pool is just right on the edge there. So it's just such a great location to stay and have, that view. And one of the best parts is waking up and either watching the sunrise over the crater from the hotel, or, you can do a sunrise tour of the crater. Just a really exceptional experience. One other cool activity that I will note, there are tons of things to do in the region, but we don't have time to get into it. But one of the other cool activities to note is that the Negev Desert is known for their death stalker scorpions. So you can actually do an evening tour, I guess when it's in season, when they're in season. But you can do an evening tour to see these scorpions, and they glow in the dark, which is just awesome.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
A little bit of a different take on bioluminescence.
Right. They're super dangerous, but you go with a guide.
Don't touch them.
Yeah, don't touch them.
Don't wave your hand through them the way you would like in the Thailand ocean, in the ocean near Thailand or anything like that.
Yeah, nothing like that. Like, go with a guide and experience.
Take the precautions. So I do have a quick question, and I know from another one of our guests, and I know you probably have no idea, but do you have any updates on if Israel's going to be open to travelers in 2021?
Yeah, actually. So, and it will be, but I have a small update that does not answer that question at all, actually. But basically, in a couple of weeks, beginning of October, Israel's going to reevaluate the border closure. It is likely that they will extend it, but they are reevaluating it at certain points. So I think that, this is my personal opinion, I think once there's a vaccine, we're going to see a lot of changes in border closures around the world, including in Israel. Israel just had an uptick, I think, from when they like reopen their schools. But they are reevaluating on, you know, the border restrictions very soon. So we should know more soon. But I imagine knowing more, it's just going to be they're extending it. So
right. So that's just kind of how things are right now. But I do want to say, if people who have had to postpone trips to Israel, because I know we have some people here who did postpone to 2021, if it isn't open and you still want to get some of that Holy Land experience, Egypt is open to American travelers with a negative COVID PCR test, I think 72 hours before arrival. And so those requirements change, but half of the Holy Land is accessible right now. So keep that in mind if you are planning if you are starting to plan trips for next year. Well, let's move on to what's next as we continue a little bit more south. And speaking of other destinations that we can combine with Israel, Jordan is usually a very popular one. And you mentioned that when visiting the Red Sea, even though we're not talking about Jordan very much today, you would stay there. Tell us what makes Jordan the better destination or the better place to stay.
Yeah, so I mean, Eilat is beautiful. I'm not going to argue against that. But Aqaba is just right on the other side of the border. You know, I mean, it takes 5 minutes to go over the border. I'd say it's probably a 15-minute drive to get to the hotel. But the luxury collection hotel Al Manara recently opened a couple of years back. It's a beautiful hotel. It's a great location overlooking the water. And while there are, nice hotels in Eilat, I would say that is the best hotel in that area. So it's just an easy way to stay at a nicer property. Aqaba can get busy, but it tends to be, less busy than Eilat. So you can kind of, visit both and escape the crowds in the evening by going over to Aqaba. And it's just a really beautiful hotel and place.
Sure. And the Red Sea is a really big scuba destination. And from what I've heard, it's supposed to be one of the best places to dive in the entire world. My scuba dive master was actually in the Israeli military. And so he detonated bombs in the Red Sea. And but I know it's a great place for wreck diving, for coral. How many do you send a lot of divers to the Red Sea when you put together itineraries?
Yeah, we do. I mean, I'm not a diver myself, so I can't really speak to how incredible it is, but it's supposed to be very incredible. It is considered some of the best diving in the world. They just have, the sea is teeming with sea life and incredible coral. There are, shipwreck dive sites off of Eilat and Aqaba. There's an eel garden. There's a coral dolphins swim. The water is supposed to be very clear certain times of the year. So yeah, we definitely send diving enthusiasts all the time. We generally book them on their own private boat where they take the day and they go to these diving sites. And if they want to go further out, they can, but those are kind of the sites that are close off the coast.
For sure. Well, guys, we are wrapping up our time in Israel. So we are going to end in Tel Aviv. And tell us, Maria, before we kind of move on to Lebanon, tell us where you would stay in Tel Aviv and what are the highlights there? Is it worth visiting if you're staying in Jerusalem, and what makes it really different from Jerusalem?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's obviously, the cultural tech sort of hub of Israel. Really, really interesting sort of comparison between old and new. But I think it's just a really cool city. I mean, if you're going to Israel for the history, obviously most travelers spend the majority of their time in Jerusalem and other locations. But Tel Aviv, I think, is worth it, spending at least 1 or 2 nights there. Just has some of the best shopping, the best restaurants, a great fashion and art and nightlife scene. Really great food markets like the Levinsky and Carmel markets, great neighborhoods to explore. But overall, I actually just recommend, kind of taking some time on your own, walking around, relaxing on the beach if the weather allows, and just enjoying the city's restaurants and cafes and people watching, it's a really cool city for that. In terms of hotels, my two top picks, I would say, are the Norman and the Jaffa. The Norman is this stylish, more intimate boutique style hotel set in these 1920s buildings. It is just such a great hotel. The service is incredible. You know, and it's kind of tucked away in a neighborhood, so it feels quiet, but you're still walking distance to some great restaurants. I'm a big fan. The Jaffa, on the other hand, is also a great option. It's a larger hotel, you know, definitely a historic aspect to it. It's a restored 19th century convent and hospital.
Oh, cool.
But they have, you know, contemporary design on the interior. So it's very atmospheric. It's also in a great location, walking distance to the old Jaffa region. But, you know, it depends on your preference. The Jaffa region tends to be more touristy, so I think it feels a little bit busier, which is why I prefer the Norman, which is a little bit more tucked away in the local neighborhood. But both great options, just depends on your preference.
Yeah, super cool. I'm a sucker for hotel pools, and that rooftop pool at the Norman is just speaking to me. But I also love converted hotels, so the Jaffa looks super cool too. And so I'll give you a break to catch your breath. But if you can, would you type the name of the Ottoman palace that was converted into a hotel in Jerusalem into the chat box? We had somebody ask about it. So guys, next we'll move on to Lebanon and Beirut. And Lebanon is one of these countries that many people still kind of think about as being unsafe due to its history of conflict. And many travelers may not consider the country, or even the Middle East for that matter, as a holiday destination. However, the country's strong sense of authenticity really creates this spectacular atmosphere for those who do choose to visit. Beirut is largely progressive, and there's really nothing like it with its Middle Eastern neighbors. It's a super unique place where you'll find these nightclubs that are next to mosques, a bombed out building that's next to a Chanel boutique, and it's a place where Christians and Muslims peacefully share a bowl of hummus side by side. And it has so many different religions and an interesting and complex history, breathtaking natural wonders, and a vibrant restaurant and nightlife scene. And it's quickly starting to gain popularity among travelers who prefer adventure and luxury without the masses of tourists. And most of us have heard in the news lately about the explosion in Beirut. So Maria, will you give us all a little bit of an update about that? And then I know Chris has some information on it that we'll let him share in a few minutes as well.
Yeah, unfortunately, the explosion along the waterfront in Beirut was devastating. You know, Lebanon had already been struggling due to civil protests and economic hardship due to COVID-19. So I do think, unfortunately, some hotels, restaurants, and businesses may never be able to reopen. But, you know, that being said, Beirut is incredibly resilient. The city and the country have demonstrated that throughout their history. So I think they will bounce back. It's just a matter of when that happens and what that will look like. But I do, you know, when I talk about the destination a little bit later on, you know, I'll point out some really great stories of things that are happening in terms of trying to rebuild. But I do think they'll bounce back.
That's good to hear. That's really good to hear. Well, with that, Chris and Adele, why don't you guys get us ready for our second wine of tonight and familiarize us a little bit with Lebanon as a wine region.
Totally. Awesome. Well, thank you all for having us here tonight. We're really excited to chat about these wines. To understand the story of Lebanon, you have to go back thousands and thousands and thousands of years. I don't know if any of y'all went to Sunday school or you studied the Torah. I did not study either the New or the Old Testament very much as a kid. I wasn't always the most studious when it came to Sunday school. But if you go back to some of those stories, the famous story of Jesus turning water into wine, that actually occurred in southern Lebanon. And there are other references that occur throughout both the Old and the New Testament that reflect, you know, the wines of Lebanon having like a superior aromatic character and like a really delicious flavor profile. So these wines have a rich, rich history. Looking at the map that we see here, we can see that to the east, we've got the Mediterranean Sea. So you have this like coastal influence, much like we saw in Israel. And then to the west, we have the Lebanese mountains. So the famous mountain range there is the Bekaa Valley. Now, the Bekaa Valley is super high elevation. We're about 1,000 meters high, so almost about 3,000 feet in elevation there. A very, very high elevation. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of indigenous red varieties that are left. The red varieties that were there were unfortunately wiped out by phylloxera, but there are a couple of white varieties that are left. Now, I had the opportunity about a week or two ago to interview the winemaker for one of the wines that we're tasting tonight. I met with Mark Hoshar. He's the third generation from Chateau Moussard. His father was Serge Hoshar, the famous winemaker who literally dodged bombings to get grapes from the vineyard to the winery in Gazir. He's the son of Serge. The founder of the winery, Gaston Hoshar, started the winery in 1930. But Mark, the current generation, he was telling me about kind of the processes by which they make the wine. And what he was saying is that these white varieties, because they were planted at a higher elevation, because it's a slightly cooler climate, the higher up you go, because of that, those grapes, those white varieties actually survived phylloxera. So Obaida and Merwa are the two white grapes that are used to make white wine in the area. Now, Lebanon has a lot of ties to France, and because of that, varieties like Cabernet Sauvignon, Cinsault, Syrah, Carignan, those are the red grapes that do really, really well. So if you think about the red wines of Bordeaux, the red wines of the Rhone Valley, those are the ones that really thrive in this high elevation area.
Which is the same that we saw kind of in Israel as well, the same varieties.
Super interesting. So tell us about, we did save the Moussard wine as our grand finale for the evening, but let's get into our other Lebanese wine. Tell us a little bit about Messiah, and if I'm saying that correctly, and the vineyard and the wine.
So the first red wine that we're going to be tasting is Messiah. This is one of the more interesting quality wines that are coming out of Lebanon. And this property and this estate started in the 90s, so not too long ago. And it was this property that the wine owner and winemaker and family had sort of like purchased. And this property and all the land around it was like completely abandoned. And there were squatters and all sorts of damage, like vegetation was scarce, and it took a lot of negotiating skills to finally clear the land that they had just purchased. And so finally, when they did get everything together, their initial intention was to make something called Arak. Have you guys ever heard of Arak before? It's a distilled spirit.
I've heard of it.
You've heard of it? Okay, so it's an unsweetened distilled spirit that's made exclusively from, as Chris mentioned, Obaida, indigenous white varietal, and also anise. And it's a translucent spirit that when you add like water or ice or something like that, it turns kind of milky, kind of like ouzo or sambuca, kind of like along the same lines. So this property originally wanted to make Arak, but then they also wanted to maybe try their hands at making wine, but they weren't exactly so skilled at it. So they decided to reach out to a very famous winemaker, and he is a gentleman from Bordeaux. His name is Dominique Hebrard, and then also the Brunier family, who also owns View Telegraph in Châteauneuf-du-Pape. So again, we've got like famous influences from very well-known, very established French winery owners and winemakers who are now coming in as that foreign investment and influence into Lebanon and making really cool quality wines, but using French varietals again. So this is your Messiah, and it is Grenache, Cinsault, and it actually has a little bit of Tempranillo in it. Yeah.
Super interesting.
In Syrah. So the average vine age here is about 40 years old. So they basically planted them or sourced some fruits from around there. And it's vinified, hand-picked, and what does it say? Oh, stainless steel, sorry. Fermented in stainless steel. So
Cool.
it's not gonna be that like super fuller bodied style. It's gonna be fresh and fruity.
Yeah, a little bit lighter in texture.
Yeah.
And so what would you eat with this?
So I actually stopped by Phoenicia Market before this episode started because it's like an untapped resource that like people forget about all the time. Phoenicia Market, it's right downtown. It's on Austin Street. And they have just this amazing selection of all sorts of little appetizers, salady things, and like cheeses and dips. And so I actually bought a bunch of stuff that we've been snacking on already. We got some traditional Lebanese, these like cheese balls. They're like orange in the middle, but the outside's coated in these like herbs, and it's kind of funky. And then we got some like Armenian string cheese and this other Egyptian cheese and some hummus. And
we also got some stuffed grape leaves, which are very interesting.
Yeah.
Super cool.
Pita. So just like the traditional like Mediterranean, Middle Eastern sort of snacky things. And because this wine doesn't see any oak to it, it's fruity, it's fresh, and it's very versatile.
Yeah, and so you can have it more with like the mezza plate rather than like a full meal. It's kind of your prep before getting into the bigger boys of the evening. And so I think it's super interesting that we keep kind of coming back to the French influence there. So before we check into our hotels in Lebanon today, Maria, I'm going to throw it back to you. And I know that Artisans of Leisure actually puts together an itinerary that combines both Beirut and Paris. So tell us a little bit more about that and how that actually works.
Yeah. So the idea was, to create this tour, based on the history. And the history is essentially at the end of World War I, Lebanon was placed under, French military control. And then in 1923, the League of Nations essentially formally gave the mandate for Lebanon and Syria to France. Bunch of other stuff happened, but basically Lebanon did not become wholly independent until I think the end of 1946. So there's a lot of French influences in Beirut. And, combining Paris and Beirut, I think is really great. You start in Paris and you head to Beirut, you can really see what kind of influences there have been in the city. Once upon a time, it was called the Paris of the Middle East. There are, Parisian style cafes, and vibrant fashion and art scenes. So combining the two, I think is just really, really interesting. So you can see, where those influences are.
That's fascinating. I was really surprised to see that on the website today when I was kind of looking things over. And we actually got a question about what you could combine with Lebanon and how that actually works. And I think that's a really good example. And especially when you can also see how intertwined the food and the wine is with all of these French influences. And so when it comes to really good food and wine, Relais and Chateau is always a standout with both their restaurants and their properties. So let's talk about these three properties here. Not all of them are in Beirut, but what have you had the chance to actually eat at this restaurant?
So I actually haven't eaten the food. I had coffee, but I have heard great things. Yeah, the coffee was excellent. But I've heard great things about the restaurant. The hotel itself is, I think, just a really great option in Beirut. I think it really provides like a lot of sense of place. It's it's a Virtuoso property, so I'm sure, Kristen, you can get, Virtuoso amenities there. But it's got this really charming mix of sort of old world and Middle Eastern styles. It can be hit or miss, depending on the traveler. It's a little bit dark, and some of the rooms feel a little bit tired, but and each room is different. So I think that's kind of when, having someone like Kristen, you know, comes in handy where they can put you in the right rooms. But I think it's really great property.
And the Gray is, or Le Gray is the other property that's actually in Beirut. And how's that kind of different from Hotel Albergo?
Yeah, so it's centrally located downtown, and it's got this, you know, a more contemporary style. It's a great luxury option. I think it works really well for somebody who wants a more contemporary, you know, trendy option. Also great for art enthusiasts. They actually, throughout their halls, they have, they feature, they exhibit artwork from local artists and international artists. But it's really great. You kind of feel like you're walking through an art museum en route to your room. I will note Le Gray was badly damaged during the explosion, and they're, you know, closed until further notice, but until they are, you know, essentially able to repair and reopen.
Yeah, I was looking at, I was researching these hotels because sadly just there's a true possibility that lots of the hotels, not just in the Middle East, but in many of the destinations that we've covered, not all of them might open up again. And we talked briefly over email about the Four Seasons, and there is a Four Seasons in Beirut. The internet is saying it's permanently closed, where Le Gray was just temporarily closed. I don't know if that's a switching in management, or if you know anything about if it was badly damaged, or but I think that's kind of a,
yeah, it was really badly damaged. It's right on the waterfront. You know, essentially like all of their windows and, you know, the whole side of the building is just all glass. I mean, completely blown out. So the last I heard, they were, you know, closed because of the damage. I have not heard that they won't reopen, but it's obviously certainly a possibility.
Well, hopefully they'll be able to recover, and that'll be an option when we all can finally visit Lebanon. So before we get in and do some sightseeing, the Mist Hotel is the last one we kind of threw on here, because this is outside of Beirut, but it is a hotel where if you want to get into the countryside and if you want to do some hiking and explore some natural landscapes, you can spend a couple of nights here. But otherwise, Beirut is a really easy city to base from as you're traveling throughout the rest of the country. So what are some of your highlights when visiting Beirut and the surrounding areas?
Sure. Yeah, so Beirut itself is just a really cool city, very, you know, vibrant, tons of great restaurants, nightlife, art galleries, museums. Within Beirut, you know, I saw that you pointed out the Pigeon Rocks is a very iconic image. It's essentially these large sea stacks just off the coast. You know, it's like a very pretty sight to see. There's also the National Museum of Beirut, which, you know, covers a lot of the history, artifacts, art. It was unfortunately badly damaged, but the Louvre actually in Paris is collaborating with Lebanon's Antiquities Authority on helping with the repairs. So that's really great. That's one of those like positive stories that hopefully they'll be able to, you know, repair and reopen sooner rather than later. You know, Beirut, like I said, is just totally amazing in terms of dining. Lebanese cuisine is actually some of my favorite. So they have excellent restaurants. M Sharif is one of the top restaurants, but I wanted to specifically point out Taulet because it's just a really cool concept. Taulet, basically each day they feature a different chef from a different village in Lebanon who is invited to cook his or her regional specialties using organic local ingredients. The quality can vary, you know, night to night because it is a different chef every day, but just overall the dishes really provide this interesting perspective on small town Lebanese cuisine. And I think it's a really great restaurant. And actually the guy who runs the restaurant, the restaurant was badly damaged during the explosion, but he gathered a team of volunteers and they're working from the damaged restaurant to feed the homeless, elderly, patients, and rescue workers. So that gives me hope that he is going to rebuild Taulet and that will be an option for you to try when you're able to make it to Lebanon one day. Outside of Beirut, Baalbek, I think, is an absolute must. It's in the Bekaa Valley, so near a lot of these wines. It is an outstanding archaeological complex and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's got its roots. It started as like a Phoenician temple complex and then was later a Greek city. So there's just a lot of layers of history there that are totally fascinating. I can, maybe let one of the wine experts go on this a little bit more, but Chateau Kassara is also in the Bekaa Valley. It's the oldest winery in Lebanon. And they have, I think great wine options. And they actually, when you do a tour of their facility, you can visit these Roman era caves that are underneath the ground that supposedly provide an ideal condition for storing the wine.
Oh, wow.
But the picture that you're looking at right now is Betadine Palace. That's another highlight. It's not too far outside of Beirut. It's located in the Shuf Mountains. It's an 18th century palace that's actually still used sometimes as the summer residence of the Lebanese president. It's just this beautiful location overlooking a valley in the mountains, and nearby, a great thing to do when you visit the palace is also go hiking in the cedar reserve nearby. You're basically hiking, amongst these centuries-old trees. And just a fun fact about Lebanese cedars, they were actually renowned in the ancient world because, civilizations throughout the region used their timber to construct ships and buildings. And then also near this, which I think is a great lunch option, is the Mir Amin Palace. It's, a former residence of an emir, and you can have a great local lunch, or you can do a cooking class there. Byblos, also another huge highlight. It's port city and actually one of the oldest continuously inhabited towns in the world. Also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. There are a lot of those in Lebanon. So tons of really interesting history to explore. And for foodies, there is this amazing open air seafood and Lebanese restaurant just right on the water overlooking the Mediterranean. It's called Dar Lazrak. I can type it in the comments section if anybody's interested, but it's excellent. And yeah, other than that, tons of great hiking opportunities, like in the Kadisha Valley, which the Mist Hotel that Kristen was talking about earlier is right by there. It's a great place to overnight, so you can do this hike. But the hike in the Kadisha Valley that's most notable is you essentially hike to these very early Christian monasteries that were like built and tucked into the sides of cliffs, in this really deep gorge. So yeah, tons of other hiking opportunities that I could talk for days about, and I'm happy to answer any questions, after this. But yeah, Lebanon is amazing, and there's just so much to do there.
It really looks like a beautiful country, and for it being as small as it is, I think we've only scratched the surface when it comes to the natural beauty as well. So we talked a little bit about the Bekaa Valley, and I'm going to invite Chris and Adele to hop on again and to take us into our last wine, to tell us a little bit more about the region from a wine perspective that we didn't cover when we first got into it. And let's open the iconic Lebanese wine that we have with us today.
Awesome. Yeah, super excited about this last wine, Chateau Moussard. This is their Hochar Perefils. So we pronounce the name Hochar. The CH makes a softer SH sound. It's not Hochar or Hokar, it's Hochar. That's their last name. And again, like we were talking about, we are in the Bekaa Valley. So a little further inland, very high elevation. We're in Mount Lebanon. So it's this valley created by the Anti-Lebanon and the Mount Lebanon mountain ranges. And it's this valley between the two that's at about 1,000 meters in elevation, very, very high up. Now, the winery itself for Chateau Moussard is actually in Gazir, much closer to the coast. If you flip this bottle around, you've got a nice handy map on the back of the bottle. And if you see there's a little tiny thing that says Gazir near the coast. It's about a 30-minute drive away from the city of Beirut, about 30 minutes north. The reason that the wine is located there and not closer to the vineyards in Mount Lebanon is because when the Hoshar family started the winery in 1930, they really didn't have any idea what the boundaries, what like the legal parameters were going to be for the country of Lebanon. So much was in flux in the early 20th century that they figured the closer they were to Beirut, the better off they were. And it's that political instability that has been a constant within the winery's history. We've talked a little bit about the Lebanese Civil War, and the fact of the matter is that is something that has been so true of the winery's development. So I mentioned it earlier, but the second generation of the winery, Serge Hoshar, he literally was transporting grapes from the high elevation vineyards in the Bekaa Valley to the winery in Gazir and like weaving his way through bombshells going off. It was wild. And he made wine every single year except for 2 vintages of the war. So the war was from 1975 to I believe 90. I believe it was a 15-year war. And during that time, he missed 2 vintages just because he couldn't transport the grapes from the vineyards in the Bekaa Valley to the winery in Gazir.
So those who might not be familiar with Chateau Moussard, what's really cool is that they release back vintages. Like I've been able to taste wines in a very small setting on very, very special occasion from like the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. Usually like once every 3 years, like one of the suppliers will come in the market and do tastings. And then you have an opportunity to purchase like maybe a handful of the bottles to then sell. But the way that these wines age are incredible. Like this is your collectible.
We'll give you guys a little bit of like a behind the scenes sort of thing. When Adele and I buy wine, we as wine buyers, generally a winery will release 90 to 99% of what they produce in a given year. They will release that into the market. And then people like Adele can carry it at 13 Celsius. You know, people at whatever restaurant can carry whatever they want. But the idea is that that winery will release almost everything they have so that it can be available. Chateau Moussard was unique. They were one of the only wineries in the world where they truly believed that the wine was better with age. And they didn't trust people to hold on to the wine themselves and like age it in their cellars. They said, no, we'll hold on to it ourselves. We will age it. And then when we believe the wine is truly ready to drink, then we will release it into the market. Now, what that means is there's a lot of financial risk there. It means they're going to hold on to this product even after they've picked the grapes and fermented the juice. They're going to hold on to those perfectly good bottles that they could sell. And rather than sell it and make that money back, they're going to hold on to those bottles and wait. So like Adele said, we had the opportunity to like essentially buy from the winery 10, 20, 30-year-old bottles of wine. Really, really cool. To put it in perspective, the current release for Chateau Moussard's rosé, I believe is 2017. Most rosés
You're drinking right now are 2019. Like they're of the same year or a year before or prior.
You know, current release I think on the white wine from Chateau Moussard is 2010 maybe.
Yeah, which is crazy. Like all these wines are, they have age on them and they release them when they think that they're ready. So what's cool about this project, the Hoshar, is that it's kind of like their baby.
Mm-hmm. This is kind of like their entry-level wine. And it's cool to find a wine where the entry wine is as complex as this one is. I mean, when I taste this wine, I'm getting like kind of like an herbal character. I'm getting a little bit of that like sumac, that like mustard green. There's like a very savory quality to this wine.
This wine to me is like, it's polished, it's finessed, it's elegant, there's a lot going on. I definitely think it's like a fuller bodied something.
So we were talking about this wine earlier, and Adele and I were like, it's got a little bit of the qualities that you like in Bordeaux because this definitely has some oak aging. She was mentioning that the Messiah was stainless steel for fermentation. These wines are oak barrels. They're importing French oak, the same oak barrels that they're using in Bordeaux, they're using on this wine. So you get some of that character, that like polish from like the oak treatment, from Bordeaux, but then the grapes that are being used here, you know, this one is going to be Cinsault 50%, Grenache 35%, Cabernet Sauvignon 15%. That's a lot of what you find in the Rhone Valley as well. So that like peppery kind of muscular, masculine character I associate with the Rhone Valley, but then that like kind of more precision, that like oak, that polish, I'm associating with Bordeaux. So I kind of get the best of both worlds, which is really fun.
That sounds super cool. So what would you eat with this wine?
What would you have?
Oh man, so we can go, I mean, something like standing.
Fire up the grill, baby. That's what I'm thinking. Let's fire up that grill. Let's cook some meat, slap some protein on there. Let's do it.
But if you're feeling inspired, we were talking about spices earlier in the episode.
Mm-hmm.
You can make like your own like 7 spice blend of like cumin, cilantro, cinnamon, clove, cardamom, and a couple other things, and just like have it your like when you're feeling Lebanese or feeling special or something like that, just like toss it on whatever and then put it on the grill. Or like in the picture suggestion here is just like the ground lamb kebab things with like a
yeah. Well, and you and I, what we actually ended up sending out to everyone was the recipe that you found from Olivia's Cuisine, which was for Quebec, I think, which is they're these like beef croquettes. And
it's like the national dish of Lebanon. Yeah.
And so I think something that has some of that spice and has some of those heavier meats would be a really good complement to this wine.
And has anyone on this chat gone to Cafe Lily off of Westheimer Road, really close to Chimney Rock in Westheimer? Cafe Lily is one of my favorite Lebanese restaurants, and they've got some amazing dishes. And I know for a fact that they've got moussar on their menu. So super
cool. Julie says, of course, their fried kebab is great. I'm saying that right. So that's super cool. And Chris, I know you touched on this a little bit earlier, but I want to let everybody know here that Chris does host a podcast called By the Glass, and you can find it on all the podcast places. And he did just interview Moussar this past week, and I saw earlier today him posting it on Instagram. So if you guys do want to do a deeper dive into this particular wine, whether you're saving it and just didn't get to it tonight, I highly recommend turning on Chris's episode while you guys listen to it. And Adele and I are going to be sending out our next wines for next week tomorrow. And we will be heading to South America. We'll be visiting Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay over the next couple of weeks. And we'll only be covering one destination an episode, so we promise we'll be better about ending within an hour. But you can also follow us on Instagram at Talk, Taste, and Travel, and on YouTube at Talk, Taste, and Travel. If you missed parts of this episode or have friends that missed it, this episode will be live at 4 p.m. This Friday. So I do want to thank Adele, I want to thank Chris, and I want to thank Maria for joining us. And before we sign off, just do a last minute Q&A. If anybody does have a few questions before we leave, Chris and Maria are both still here. I know Chris has to run in like 10 minutes, but toss them in the chat box or unmute yourselves and ask away.
My question really fast though was that, and we might have missed this earlier or something because we were munching on some snacks, but like you can't go directly to Beirut. Is that where you have to connect through Paris?
Maria, do you want to answer
Sorry.
that? No worries.
I'm struggling to, yeah, I mean, you don't have to go through Paris. You can go through other, like when I've gone through Istanbul. But yes, they're connecting flights. I don't know what the flights look like from Houston. But from New York, you can connect through Paris or Istanbul.
We can as well. We've got direct flights to both Paris and Istanbul. So both of those are really good options. And I think somebody earlier had mentioned in the chat box that they actually were able to visit earlier this year, one of the countries going through Istanbul because they had been there for over 2 weeks. So something to keep in mind. And I do have a quick question, Maria. One of our guests asked if you could just touch really quickly again on safety for Americans in Beirut and Lebanon.
Sure.
And I know you said that at the beginning, but if you could just refresh.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the stuff that I said at the very beginning, kind of about the Middle East and Israel in general, really applies to Beirut and Lebanon. I have felt safe as a solo female traveler. Everyone that I've sent has, you know, felt safe when, you know, they've talked about how surprised they were and how safe they felt. And yeah, I mean, I would say, you know, a lot of the same things, you know, I see in the chat box, you said that you've been to Israel and it's lovely and safe. Any sort of misconceptions you might have had about Israel before going, it's kind of the same thing with Lebanon. Obviously, that may be different right now with everything that's going on there. But pre this mess, it's great. I felt safe, and I highly recommend going.
And I think that's just an area where, whether you're planning a trip with Artisans of Leisure, with a travel advisor, it is good to work with somebody when planning a trip to the Middle East, so that you have that guidance on what to expect and how to have fun without having to look over your shoulder during your stay there. Yeah. Well, guys, thank you all so much. Chris, thank you again. Maria, thank you again. It was so good to have you guys. And we will see you all next week. And can't wait, y'all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
See you later.